you have debated against All-Type, and I think that All-Type has missed some of your points, and so I'd like to start over on this and lay out what is my definition of race. So my definition of race comes from many dictionary, like popular dictionaries and even Google dictionary, which define race as people have ensembles of characteristics that are physical or that are mental, and these characteristics differ across groups of humans, and these characteristics are inherited. And it is my claim that race exists. You can always have imperfect labels for race. You may not be able exactly to tell whether someone is of a race or another. There can be cases along a continuum. That being said, the general statement that people have inherited characteristics, including their genes and the effects of their genes in their body, it does exist, and that the human population is non-randomly distributed for these characteristics, which means that you can expect to find more of these genetic characteristics in the black populations of Africa than you would in America, for example. Is that a statement you agree with?
No, it's not, although it's a long one and there's a lot there.
All right, so what would you disagree with?
Well, just going through your definition, I would say that race is a political category, one that was constructed, one that is institutionally sustained. You say it's inherited. I disagree. I don't think it's inherited. Well, to the extent that it is, it's socially inherited and not something that's biologically inherited. Of course, race exists. I don't think either of us would disagree with that. It's real. The impacts that it has on people's lives are material and important. I would say that you say that this is along a continuum and that because it's normally distributed, you may expect to find certain things. I agree with all of those. I don't think in any way that's in tension with the idea that this is a political and socially constructed category. As you know, the first law of behavioral genetics is that everything is heritable. Social constructions are everything. And so, of course, they are heritable. Not that they are everything, but they're part of everything.
Well, let's start at the basics here. The skin being black, for example, the amount of melanin in the skin. You say it is socially inherited, or do you recognize that it is genetically inherited, the color of the skin?
That would naturally be biological.
All right, so from that point, we have a phenotypical characteristic that respects my conditions for race. We have the characteristic that is observable. We can separate people based on this characteristic into groups. Some people may be black, some people may be white, some people may be along the continuum. And these characteristics are inherited, and you've acknowledged this. So on that basis, you do recognize that it meets my definition of race, at least.
Well, I think you'd be hard pressed to find kind of those very easy groupings to fit people into. You wouldn't be able to draw those groupings at, for example, continental level. I think it begs the question of what groups are you calling a race? Because while that sounds good theoretically, the idea that yes, we can identify people visually into races because we've come to associate a certain set of phenotypic traits with them, that's not really a product of the biologicalness of race. That's a product of the way that race is deeply embedded in our society and the way that it's very affectively produced, which means it's kind of a gut reaction. We've been socialized so deeply into it.
Well, I don't see any evidence that it comes from society. First, young people who are not trained at all to react to race, they will naturally develop this categorization. And so there is something of an observable phenotype here that triggers something in the brain of young children, and it allows them to categorize people as being part of their group. And then yes, it can take a political dimensions. However, primarily if we just talk about the genes itself, the gene, they cause these features are inherited, and these features are observable by a non-informed individual, an individual, even in principle, if you add an individual that would not have been tainted by any sort of political manipulation or propaganda, he would be able to say this guy is has darker skin than this other guy. And so at this point, we are faced with a set of information that you may argue has political consequences, and I wouldn't disagree with you on this, but the consequences themselves, the phenotypical observations, they can be done without even a reference or a knowledge of politics.
So I would ask for more details about that study. It is certainly not accurate that there is a study in which people with no knowledge of race either placed people on a continent according to where they came from or prescribed them into a group on the basis of, saying that they were a certain word for a race, right? And or the idea that they ascribed traits to them. I would also say that, yes, of course, these things are inherited, but just because something is inherited, like skin color, doesn't make it a contingency for race. For example, if you compare the skin color of, for example, many Europeans and a wide variety of Asians, you will likely find matches. If you look at people within common hemispheric lines, you will find similar skin colors. That's not really a product of anything special about your skin color. Of course, it's inherited, just like everything else is inherited. But there's nothing particularly special about that makes people categorized on the basis of race.
On your first statement, there's a study by D.J. Kelly saying 3 months old, but not newborns, prefer own-race faces. And so this study shows that there is an ability for very young infants, we're talking about 3 months old, to distinguish the features of race. I've copied the link in the lobby here. To distinguish these features and to even develop preferences for the features of the faces that are part of their own race.
Well, I think, first of all, those studies present very polarized ideas of what races are, and what they're in fact measuring is not race, which is, of course, not actually something that you could measure in an experiment like that, but it's probably detecting difference, which makes a lot of sense. People, especially babies, tend to show preference for specifically people who look like their parents. Now, that is a heritable trait. What your parents look like is something that is necessarily heritable. Now, it's unsurprising to find that babies who are genetically and evolutionarily adapted to go to things that look like them will then ascribe that trait onto other people who look most similar to them. That is still not a basis for race. And if you look at other anecdotes, since that is all that is, if you look at other anecdotes, you'll find stories like there was a nice story in the news about a young white boy and a young black boy that both got the same haircut and thought that this would make them indistinguishable to their teacher because they weren't looking at each other on the basis of skin. They hadn't been conditioned to put such a high, not even just social priority, but even visual priority on those kinds of differences between them.
Well, to clarify, I don't offer this this article as proof that races exist. I don't say that this article shows that there is a basis for race. What I'm saying is that the racial characteristics that we typically think of as racial, such as skin color and people just self-identifying or placing other people in certain ethnic groups, that 3 months old are able to tell the difference between these people and they develop preferences. What you suggest is a potential mechanism by which this differentiation it could be explained that the child care about these differences. You're saying it's probably because the child is recognizing someone who's similar to them. I will say this is a mechanistic explanation. It doesn't resolve the fact that the child does have a preference and that this preference is applied to people that we classify as in different races. Of course, a three-month-old is not aware of these categories, and therefore it's almost a perfect experiment in the sense that he cannot have been influenced by language. He can only have been influenced by the natural interaction with his parents, which, yes, include the recognition of similar features to him. However, it does result in a racial categorization. And you say it's an anecdote. It is not an anecdote. It is a study by David J. Kelly and others. It has been published in Scientific Papers 2008. These are not anecdotes. They try to look with a sample of a sufficient sample of children to see if an effect can be mathematically detected.
In order to conclude that the article shows a basis for race, you have to come in ideological assumption that race exists. And honestly, JF, you know that that is not how science works, that the idea that something maps onto a common perception that we have based on an ideological Enlightenment era project is not scientific proof for the idea that race exists. You cannot confirm the idea that it is race that is creating these differences. And it also isn't distinct to just race itself. If you take people who look different, right, who have dark skin, but are from a variety of regions, you are likely to produce that same effect. Again, it's not surprising that babies form admiration or form attachments to people who look most like their parents, because that's an evolutionary adaptation that humans have and that most animals have. Now, I obviously will not deny the idea that if you took a contiguous area on a map and you circled it, you would get people who looked more similar than someone very far away. That is to be expected in the nature of evolution and human migration. But the idea that those traits either are constitutive of what we colloquially define as race, or that it is meaningful at all beyond literal physical differences that I guess infants maybe care about, I feel like we can do better than the cognition of 3 months old, though.
Well, first I want to go back to the straw man, which I had already addressed, but I will readdress it. I am not suggesting that this article shows a basis for race. I am suggesting that the characteristics that we classify into races, they can be detected by 3 months old, and 3 months old can have preferences for these characteristics, no matter if these characteristics, you want to call them race, or you want to call them parents being similar to each other, or people resembling each other. To me, at the moment, you acknowledge that yes, there are geographical variations in phenotype that are clustered such that people of a certain, you take people at a certain point of the map of planet Earth and they differ from others in ways that are genetically inheritable. That's all that I ever said about race. It is what race is. The fact that evolution drives population which are separate to different points into the multi-dimensional space of genetics and phenotypes that are influenced by genetics.
That still is not a basis for race, because you would never be able to draw those lines on a map. You can take any two populations and you can find genetic differences between them. And global, continuity only provides you maybe an easier basis for that, since people who live not in Africa tend to be of a smaller subset of genes, because only so many people migrated out at a time, and so you took a smaller amount of genetic diversity with you. So it makes sense that yes, some migration would produce some of those changes, but to separate those into races, you would have to be able to draw lines around populations that are sufficiently distinct, and you can't do that. No matter where you draw the line, the people on either side of that line, as again contiguous with each other, will be far more similar to each other than they will from wherever the other side of that line you've drawn extends to. And so it's fundamentally irrational and non-scientific to draw a random line with no biological basis just because you feel like those people are better.
Well, there's lots of strawmans in there, and you are attempting to impose a threshold on my definition of race, which I've not imposed. My definition of race would still work in an entirely continuous environment where people, let's say between Europe and Africa, suppose that each country between Europe and between some point in Europe and some point in Africa, suppose that each country would be increasingly racially mixed in a kind of smooth and perfect fashion. Even there, my conception of race would remain. And so when you say I have to draw a line, no, I don't have to draw a line, because I never claimed that race were a discrete category that was perfect. Race is an imperfect term that seeks to describe clusters of genetic variation, clusters that are similar to each other. And you say these things don't emerge from nature. They do emerge from nature. They do emerge from a purely from an observer that has no training about race. Rosenberg has shown as such. For example, if you take the genetics of various people in Africa, Europe, Central, South Asia, East Asia, Oceania, and America, and you tell the algorithm, okay, divide these people in 2 groups, and you see the algorithm separates people from Europe, Africa, Middle East puts them together in orange here, and takes the East Asian, the Americans, and the Oceanians and put them in another cluster in purple. Now, the more you continue increasing the number of groups that you allow the algorithm to consider, the more the algorithm figures out the structure of the population and ends up separating at 5 or 6 groups, for example, ends up very well separating the Africans in orange here versus the Europeans and Central South Asian in teal, and then the East Asian in pink, and then the Americans in purple. And so you have a system here that didn't know about race, that has simply taken SNPs that came from nature, and it ended up finding the structure of the population that we knew because we asked people where they were coming from. And so yes, these patterns emerge from nature. We may have human words and social words to describe these patterns, but these patterns are real. We see them from nature.
Well, first of all, which study was that? I couldn't get a good enough look at it.
So let me just make sure it is the Rosenberg et al. 2002 in Science. I can send you a copy in the lobby
good.
here.
I just wanted to make sure.
So here's the link.
Noah Rosenberg led a particularly high-profile project, and he was among the first to use computer software to detect clusters of genetic similarity in unidentified DNA samples from people across the globe. And he sampled genetic information from just over 1,000 people from 52 global populations. Then he put them into an algorithm and he asked it to sort them into 5 groups. And when you sort people into 5 groups, unsurprisingly, on the basis of, again, kind of the natural boundaries of time and space, or I guess sort of geographic boundaries that we can see from things like oceans, divided people into 5 continents: Africa, Eurasia, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. And it's important to note that this is not Europe, as you point out. It is Eurasia, which encapsulates a lot of the Middle East and parts of North Africa. And it begs the question, though, is this an example of modern science kind of validating these old Enlightenment scholars' racial typographies? And the answer is no, of course not. And for one thing, as I mentioned, Eurasia is an indistinguishable geographic region. And of course, that's not what anyone means when they talk about the European or the white race, right? If we put a label on the race that would correspond to those regions, that's not colloquially what people mean by it, and that's important. The other important thing to know is that you can break that down further. So perhaps you want 6 genetic regions and not 5. And that would pull out the idea of the Kalash tribe in northern Pakistan. But here's the thing, you don't break it down into 6 groups because 6 groups doesn't align with the idea of your political narrative that we can divide people on the basis of continents. But the most important thing about this is that Rosenberg later revealed that his team also analyzed the data using 6 to 20 clusters, but he didn't publish those results because Structure, the program that he used, identified multiple ways to divide the sampled individuals whenever you pick a number larger than 6. And so, yes, you could theoretically divide people into a way that is, is imperfect, that doesn't account for large swaths of increased similarities that cluster much more accurately when you have, much higher numbers that you sort people into. But ultimately, there is no reason to choose any one of these over any other one. The only reason why you would choose to focus on those is to validate an ideological and preconceived notion of race. Otherwise, it's infinitely regressive. You could form any population you wanted.
You cannot form any population you want. I would argue you can form any population that the genetics variations will allow you to form, which is a subset of all possibilities. You could have, in principle, you could have a very random human population. If everyone was taking the plane 10 times in their life and changing where they live on the earth, let's say every 10 years, and making babies pretty much all around the earth, you could have a very distributed human population. But that's not what these articles show. These articles show, and it doesn't matter to me the k equals 5 or k equals 6, unlike what you claimed. I do not care about dividing the human species into specifically 5 or 6 races. In fact, I'm all for, and I've published a video saying we could divide it in 600 races if we want. And Rosenberg did mention in his article that there there were sub clusters, and the sub clusters, they, of course, as we expect, they also reflect geographical origin, but in a much more local fashion. But these things would not be obtained if there was no genetic differences between groups of humans. And all of the word salad that you drop here today is kind of escaping this very simple question. Are humans different genetically across the globe? Because if you say yes to that question, as far as I'm concerned, you've validated my conception of race.
So you make one incorrect statement in that's particularly important, and that's that you say that you could theoretically divide people into 600 races. But the point I made that you don't respond to is that when you ask Structure, the program that Rosenberg designs and use, to categorize people into more than 6 races, it returns multiple options. How would you select which of those multiple options you would choose? It would be completely arbitrary. And so the idea of race breaks down at every level. When you have too few groups, it incorporates people that do not fit our notions of race. And you call that kind of you shrug your shoulders and you say, well, so will happen, but that's not how science works, right? Science doesn't just ignore the exceptions that break down our narrative. Science looks for ways to accurately categorize people. And it's very telling that when things become more discrete and more broken down, that we can't just choose one way to do it. It doesn't stay within a continent. It doesn't even stay within, kind of an easily delineated population. And because of histories like colonialism, you often find very bizarre things. He ran analyses that separated out people into as many as 20 groups, and the returns were so incoherent that it really validates the idea that there's nothing that suggests that human populations cluster genetically into groups. Now, statistically, you are correct that you can find genetic differences when you select a population, but that will always be true, no matter what you select for. Any 2 groups of people will have different genes. That's just because they're not the same.
Absolutely, and that's all I mean. Now, as far as the division of humanity in 20 other groups, I don't deny it like you seem to be claiming. I am all for it. And I stand by anything that science can reveal to us if the studies have been properly done, and if we find out, for example, that there has been such traveling between continents that if you divide humanity into 20 races, you end up having people of a given race being spread across the world, just like the Jews, just like Halsey. Look at Halsey. He has more genes in common with a Jew from India than he has probably with his neighbor. That's because, yes, people travel, and yes, there are lines of genetic similarity that develops across the world in a way that violates continent boundaries. And no, I do not deny this richness of human civilization and the fact that, yes, within a continent, you now have diverse sets of people because precisely there was lots of traveling, there was lots of race mixing, there were events of conquering and war. That's all fine. I do not deny this. And unlike what you claim, the 20K division of Rosenberg does not cause issues to me. I don't have a narrative that I want to push with this other than the search for truth. Now, it would be deceptive of me to then say, oh, because the 20 groups differ and they are less linked to continents, then race doesn't exist, because I have a responsibility to inform people that no, the categories that you feel are Black, Asian, and white, they still contain information. You still know more from the world if you have these words than if you don't have them. Because when you say a Black person in America and you say this must be a descendant of slaves, you may not be right, but you're less likely to be wrong than if you were to flip a coin.
Sure, maybe. I'm not sure that the math checks out on that, but more importantly, you say that the division, fair enough. You say that the division doesn't bother you, but that's a bit of a problem. The idea that you would make a selection between a computer output that has many different ways to genetically categorize people and that the decision you would make would be one that is fundamentally ideological because it doesn't bother you that there is not a consistent way to identify people genetically, is indeed a problem. And the kind of continental distribution would require you to, for example, categorize Egyptian people into being Black. And that is not how we categorize the Middle East and North Africa. We do not racially and visually categorize those people as Black. They do not meet the visual model. They do not have a dark skin color. They don't have, whatever other characteristics we ascribe. The characteristics that we tend to ascribe to the American category of Black tends to be a very specific subset of Africa, which is the most diverse country by a lot. 95% of all human diversity is contained within the continent of Africa. And actually, I think it's just sub-Saharan Africa, not even the whole continent. But point being, extraordinarily genetically diverse populations, ones that are more different from each other than they are from, for example, Europeans. And so you're making an ideological claim. And the reason why you are is not necessarily that you're not looking at the data correctly. It's that this is not a scientific question. It cannot be carried out in a scientific manner. You cannot ascribe traits beyond, a person looks like this, and you can determine that, sure, from their genetic composition, what they're likely to look like, as you can with many phenotypes, although contingent on some environmental things with things like height and whatnot. But that's fundamentally an ideological process. And the reason that ideology is important is because when Enlightenment scholars were conceiving the notion of race, they did it in a way that ascribed a lot of social characteristics to those races, not merely phenotypic ones. And so it is important that race breaks down. This does matter.
Well, to me, it doesn't, because to me, anything that comes out of a k-means algorithm will be true in some way. And so if someone tells you, I care about the truth that is revealed at k equals 5, or I care about or let's say someone is more original and says, I personally care about the truth that's revealed at k equals 20. It remains the case that all of these findings are statistically significant, so they contain information. To the extent that people find it useful at k equals 5 because they can then distinguish between a Black and an Asian and a white, it has some use, to the extent that these categories then allow people to detect actual genes, which we find differ across people. When we consider 100 SNPs or more, 1,000 SNPs, we find out, yes, when you thought of this person being Asian, it was actually referring to genes that differ. And so the category Asian versus white does contain information, and that is the threshold of science. You say that choosing an arbitrary level such as 5 races is unscientific. No, all of it is scientific. Then you do have some subjective choices. If you start caring about white versus Asians, you will not have all of the information of the genetic diversity in this population. But it doesn't matter. As long as there is information, it can inform your decisions. And I know, for example, that if I was to make babies with 1,000 Asian females and 1,000 Black females, that most likely the group of children that would emerge from the 1,000 Asian females would have higher IQ. And so from that moment, it is useful in my life to have these categories, and science shows us that these categories refer to actual genetic differences.
I'm pausing for a moment to place this in the right way. There's something Turkheimer said, and that I largely agree with, which is that the nature of the studies that you do, that scientists do around this, or social scientists do around this, make it impossible to have an honest conversation about this question, because you still fundamentally ignore the ideology that has to go into the selection for the category that you are saying is meaningful. Again, there is not a genetic basis to the idea of Blackness, and there is certainly not and I mean, that's obvious in the sense that, like I said, the continental distributions encapsulate people who far exceed our conceptions of race. And you keep repeating this idea that what you're saying is scientific, but this is quasi-scientific at best, right? Statistics are not the same thing as science, because as I mentioned before, statistically, any two groups of people, especially ones that are likely to have kind of clustering of genes because you've picked a common geographic area, they will have genetic differences. That is inevitable. That's not meaningful. That will happen with everything. That will happen with every trait you could possibly think of, and all those things will always be heritable. Now, we should have the IQ question in a moment, but I think it's important to reckon with the idea that when you say, most likely, that you say that we can make certain decisions based on this, that race has a utility, that it can be validated, and particularly when you say, quote, it has some use. Of course, race has use. I don't think anyone denies that, but the use is not what you think. Race as an ideological project has always served a political function, and I don't think that that's contentious. But the idea that because race has a use, and the idea that because things correlate with conceptions of race do not make them biological or genetic projects. And I'll give you one other example. So I never know if it's Neil Reich or Risch. I'm assuming it's Reich. But Reich and Broussard relied on genetic material when they constructed their database for genetic ancestry from 2 or 3 different indigenous groups from each of the 5 continents. And together, those were supposed to represent and encapsulate the entirety of human race. There was another study done in which 3 sub-Saharan populations, which were 2 pygmy groups, and the Losango stood in for all of Africa, while Chinese, Japanese, and Cambodians, 1 population from each, represented all of East Asia. And then North Europeans and North Italians, they were representing all of the Caucasians. And so sampling a handful of ethnic groups like that, which is often the process that's undergone in these kinds of projects, it reflects a basic tenet of racial thinking, that because races must be composed of uniform individuals in some way, that anyone can represent the whole group. And so our view of this idea of the big few, right, of continentally specific categories for people, or just racially, however you would want to categorize them, it would change if not for our curious convenience of overlooking places when we do these kinds of studies, places like India, right, who don't fall into the Asian cluster, who don't fall into the Eurasian cluster, but rather when we do studies of their DNA markers, we find that they can trace their lineages to Africa, Central Asia, Southern China, Europe, and you choose to simply ignore those groups. And that really is the evidence of the non-scientificness of what you're saying. Science does not create models and then ascribe meaning to them on the basis of what sometimes works. That is not biology. That's just kind of snake oil salesman.
I would argue that the nature of science is to provide information to an observer, and that ultimately we have a valid scientific theory when that scientific theory allows us to make accurate predictions about the future. And by accurate, I don't even mean 100%, I mean more than random. From the moment you say the words more than random, you have a scientific theory. I would argue that's at least my basis for empiricism and my philosophical understanding of what science is, and that's how I proceed. Now, you say that there are I don't remember the words you used, but I think you mentioned that there are presuppositions that are entering in these studies. Now, yes, definitely, and there is limited sampling. However, when I look at the sampling of Rosenberg, I see that Africa has a sample of Bantu people, a sample of Mandenka, a sample of Yuba, San, and in fact, when you look at all of the samples that have been taken, and by the way, each of these cases contain dozens and some hundreds of individuals. And so when I look at this, what the algorithm is telling me, and by the way, the algorithm, all the information that the algorithm of Rosenberg has is, 1, the genetics of individuals, so not even their full genome, but a subset of their genome, and we give the algorithm an input which is the K value, either 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And you see that, yes, there is genetic diversity. For example, the Bantu versus the Mandenka. You can see that when you divide by K equals 3 or anything above, you will see that there's a little teal part here in the Bantu, and this part is not there in the Mandenka, or it's less there. And so what this tells you is, yes, this algorithm has captured a part of the genetic diversity within Africa, and it kind of places the Bantu to be like 20% what? 20% European and Middle Eastern and Central Asian and South Asia. So it kind of tells you we have this group in teal here, and these people, the Bantus, they do have some genes that are shared with this group such that the algorithm is, well, I wouldn't say confused, I would say the algorithm properly reveals that there is a shared there is a genetic similarity. It's only a part of the individual genes that are shared like this, which is why you see the teal part here appear at about 20% of the height rather than 100%. And so these studies, they do capture a lot of the genetic diversity, not all. And yes, I wish that one day we can go to a full random sample of full genome sequencing of hundreds of thousands of human beings. But until we're there, what we find is that the algorithm tells us that, yeah, even if there is some genetic similarities, I can still place people that are as distant as each other, such as the Yuba versus the Bantu. I can still place them in the same cluster. And that tells you something. It tells you that the algorithm, just from the perspective of knowing only the genes, can still come with categorizations that are very similar to those that a normal human being with no scientific knowledge would come to.
Well, I don't think that the idea that people can come to these conclusions having been indoctrinated into race as a way of seeing the world tells us much, but this still is not particularly compelling. You'll notice again a marked absence of testing from regions that complicate these genetic pictures by being in the middle. And again, you have not responded to the idea that if his genetic groupings are true, then that means that the Middle East and parts of North Africa are part of the white population, which is not how we colloquially in the United States perceive of as white. And it's also not how people, if you ask them kind of typically, would categorize people. If you showed people pictures from different populations, they would not categorize those people into whiteness. And that makes sense because whiteness is a political category that, yes, happens to rotate around Europe, which makes sense because it is an Enlightenment idea that spread through that area first. But most importantly, right, the idea that, I mean, there's no explanation for that, right? There's no scientific explanation for why you would simply omit those groups or why you would simply not consider those populations white. I mean, I've heard you talk many times about your kind of urgency or at least desire to exclude Muslim populations from the idea of, for example, an ethno-state, but even your own genetic study does not provide you the basis to do that on.
No, I mean, I'm excluding Muslims not based on genetics. However, many Muslims being Middle Eastern, I could exclude them based on an immigration law that would keep Middle Easterners from entering the country. But I agree that my problem with the Muslim religion is a problem with the religion. I do have issues with immigration from the countries that are Muslim for even other reasons than religion. But yes, for religion also. I don't claim that my rejection of Islam is a racial decision or that it is a racial policy. Now, you mentioned the fact that there is a genetic cluster that could cover everything from Europe to North Africa and including many Middle Eastern area. I've recognized as much in my video, What is White? And I said, if you wanted to come with a definition of what a Caucasian is, a Caucasian from the kind of old scientific classification, you might actually make a whole circle including Europe, Middle Eastern area, and North Africa, and you could end up saying that yes, for example, Egyptians are white in that sense. Yes, however, as I pointed out in that video, personally, when I say I want to make an ethno-state and I would like to have a white European ethno-state, I'm not talking about this entire cluster, and I've shown data of clustering. There's lots of PCA analysis that are made on these populations. You can distinguish much further than this great genetic cluster. You can distinguish Slavs within Russia. Various types of Slav. You can distinguish the Slavs from the Basque, from the French, from the English. And so the genetic data is much deeper than just separating blacks from whites. It can also distinguish people of different countries within Europe, even within white Europe, as I think of it, and as many people in the alt-right think of it, even this as subdivisions. And we end up in my community having great questions, such as a Slav who was like, hey, can I be in the white ethno-state? And if you have a Western European definition of what is white, you might very well exclude Russians. That's a both scientific decision in the sense that it is based on facts, and it is also an arbitrary political preference based on subjective perceptions of who should be in your countries and who you want to associate with. Now,
and yet it's profoundly unscientific, JF. You're not dealing with the problem with this logic, which is that you could separate French people from, say, Russian or Norwegian people. But in order to do that, you have to predetermine the boundaries of a nation, a profoundly political move. And yes, you could differentiate that, but you couldn't do it with a program like Structure, the one that you are citing and the one that you are showing graphs for. A program like Structure would not return those national boundaries to you because, as I mentioned, anytime you test more than 6 groups, you start getting returns of increasingly more complicated and higher numbers exponentially of different ways that you can group people. There's not just one way to do it. The choice to do that on the basis of nationality is a very explicitly political decision. But even what you mentioned before, right, the idea that you could draw the white race around the idea of Caucasians, even though that, of course, doesn't deal with the idea that people do not look at Middle Easterners and North Africans as white, which violates your perception that race is this obvious and identifiable thing. But, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with this? But there's not you can't do that in the program, right? Like there's no way for you to draw those lines using the same objective scientific methods as you claim that they are, right? The algorithms that you are citing, those algorithms would not produce the outputs that you're looking for. And you just sort of brush that off and you don't seem to find it to be a problem, but it is a problem because that's not a scientific method. It's something that's dressed in a scientific rhetoric, as this kind of thing usually is. And the idea of race has always been dressed in a scientific rhetoric. But in fact, what it is a convenient way for people to separate people from each other, to create cheaper labor, and to scare the shit out of the rest of the population who's left wondering if that's what their lives could look like if they dare to challenge the status quo. And that's always how race has functioned in America. And that's always how it's been invested with social meaning. And the meaning that it's been invested with, these sort of nonchalant ways that you make decisions about people, right? The idea that you simply brush off the genetic realities, that you cannot sort people into the groups that you're talking about, that there is no way to encapsulate the idea of Blackness into a genetic structure that uses an algorithm like the one you're describing. None of that matters to you because ultimately you buy into this as an ideological project, not a biological one that has done incredible amounts of damage to the world, but you're not concerned with that.
Well, I may not be concerned. I'm not sure about what you're talking about. But to address your first point, I'm not claiming that the program structure should be used to determine the entry to an ethno-state. In fact, in my video, What is White, I'm not using Structure. I am using PCA, which is Principal Component Analysis. And you can see here that yes, there is a scientific basis to differentiate people who live in France from people who live in Russia. All you have to ask yourself in a PCA analysis is, could I draw a good circle around the target population? So would I be successful in drawing a circle that separates French people from, who are they, the Sardinian people here? Of course I would. And to that extent, what this tells you is, yes, there are facts within the genetics of these populations that differentiate them. Now you say it's unscientific to then make decisions about me wanting to live separate from the Sardinians. I almost agree, but I don't agree with the term you use. You say unscientific. It is non-scientific, yes. It is a political decision to say, I want to live separate from these other people with this other genetic. But it is it is not expected that political decisions are only scientific. Political decisions are based on facts, and to the extent that the genetics of these people are different, that's the fact we can base ourselves on. But political decisions, they express more. They express a preference, they express a sense of morality that people have, and they express simply a decision of people to use their liberty to segregate from each other. Now, it is not unscientific to the extent that it is based on fact, but it is non-scientific in the sense that, yes, it emerges from a political desire and from a use of people's liberty, such as the liberty that I use if I go into a bar and I happen to prefer Asian women. I like their ass, their boobs, I like the way they look. What's the problem with this? If I have a preference, will you come to my bed and say, Jeff, you're making a non-scientific decision by fucking this Asian woman? No, of course. And it's the same thing for politics.